right, good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Leventis. I teach painting here at UNCC, and I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Aspen Hohalter, who teaches photography. And it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Jack Halberstam join us today, who will be speaking with us from New York City. I'd like to just say a few words to introduce Jack, and Jack obviously has an extensive resume, and I know we have limitations on our time, so I'll be brief. Jack Halberstam is professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. He's the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, and a short book titled Trans Asterix, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variance. Jack's latest book, which is out here in 2020, is titled Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. And one of the great things about this Friday lecture series is that we can have not only artists, but also writers and scholars who share with us ways that they use art to think through big ideas and then share those ideas with us. So we've been working to get Jack to campus since before 2020, since the pandemic and this harrowing year. And I'm still optimistic that one day we will, soon, I hope. But for now, I'm thrilled that Jack can join us online to discuss some of his ideas from his book, Wild Things. And we'll be sure to put the link in the chat so that everyone can check that out. So Jack, without further delay, we'd like to welcome you to UNCC and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew and Aspen, for hosting me. Thank you all for being here, whatever that means nowadays, virtually. I am really excited to share with you today some of the ideas from this new book, which is called Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. But I don't just want to repeat the arguments of the book. I want to draw out some of the logics of the book and then make a gesture at the end towards a second volume that I'm working on, which is called The Wild Beyond, Essays on Art, Architecture, and Anarchy. And hopefully when that book comes out, Andrew will invite me back and we will actually be able to meet in person. So this is the book, and I just wanted to point to the cover image, which is by an artist, a queer Asian American artist, Candice Lin, who's based in LA, and whose work really meditates on the relationship between queerness and environmental decline. And this piece is called Petrification. And it isn't, you know, exactly a real creature. And that's part of why I chose it for the cover of the book, is to try to get at this relationship between the real and the imagined, the wild and the disorderly, and so on. So that's what I want to talk to you about a little bit now. So in the new book, Wild Things, I make a number of claims, and I just want to start by going over some of those claims for you so that you know what the stakes of the book look like. Okay, so there are 3 sections to the talk. The first section is, as you can see, just called Wildness. And I'll try to move through this a little bit more quickly than I might, because I am deeply interested in your thoughts, comments, and questions. Now, if you look at this image, I'm sure most of you immediately recognize the imagery from Maurice Sendak's very beloved children's book, Where the Wild Things Are. And yes, I take my title from Sendak's children's book, partly because it gives you this sort of very beautiful visual allegory of the wild that precisely kind of captures what the wild is and is not in the book that I have written. And just so you know, Maurice Sendak was a gay man. This book was not immediately accepted as a children's classic. In fact, there were some libraries and some bookstores that didn't want to carry it because they thought it was too scary, too dark, too difficult for children. But Sendak's point was, children are dark and difficult, and children recognize things that adults have very often tidied up. And one of those things that children are very tuned into, that adults are a little bit more anxious about, is wildness. And so we get this beautiful story in Where the Wild Things Are that I think explains to us how the wild is not a place, not an absence, not a mode of being, and not a form of subjectivity. It is instead a kind of conceptual place that is opened up, if you like, in relationship to the domestic home, the family, the nuclear family. And it is a place that is in exile from the home. And what we learn in Where the Wild Things Are is that the wild things represent a kind of ruination upon which the family home depends. So Where the Wild Things Are is a place that is populated by everyone who has been expelled from domestic heteronormativity. But more than that, the wild also represents a kind of rapidly disintegrating boundary between the human and non-human animals, subjects and objects, beings and things. And you'll remember that Max goes there. He's super happy to have left his mother and father behind. He enters into this realm full of wild things, and they make him their king. But he decides he doesn't want to be king of the wild things, and he goes back home. And the question that my book asks is, what happens if we do not leave the place where the wild things are and we stay a while with them? Okay. Now, on a more theoretical level, I want to make the argument also, and just stay with me a minute for this, because it's not obvious what I mean by this second point. Wildness is a discursive force that underpins the order of things. So for anyone who's read Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, he describes a world within which colonial explorers, discoverers, and thinkers in the 18th century went out into the world from Europe and began to catalog and classify everything that they found. And this leads to the rise of the discipline of botany, biology. Many of the botanical gardens in Europe come from this period. But what it also does in the scholarship that is produced in that time, it produces a false sense of order, a sense that there is an order of things, and all the colonial explorer needs to do is go out, discover it, bring pieces of it home, and then civilize and rule all the places of disorder. That, in many ways, to be honest with you, is the plot of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which comes up many times in my book. But this is a fiction. It's a fiction that there's an order of things. And by the way, if there is an order of things, there must always be, at the same time, a disorder of things that has been suppressed by the production of knowledge. So my book also goes in search of this disorder that has been suppressed and that has not easily collapsed into the knowledge projects of the 18th and 19th century. Behind all of this is what Sylvia Wynter calls a coloniality of being, in which the order of things presumes at its helm a white man who is scripting life, order, symmetry for the rest of the world. And so you can see then why wildness might hold within it some political potential for a kind of decolonial, a queer, and even possibly an anti-capitalist political orientation. Okay, third, and trigger warning, explicit sexual content. This is an image by an artist, Kent Monkman, who is a First Nations Swampy Cree two-spirit artist, and I'm going to talk about his work in a moment. But it gives you a kind of reversal of the encounter between cowboys and Indians against the backdrop of the American West. And I'm using this image to ask the question, what is queerness after nature? Now, before the 19th century, homosexuality was deemed abhorrent by the church, which characterized homosexuality as a sin. But by the 19th century, homosexuality, transsexuality, all kinds of minority sexualities and genders were cast not as sinful, but unnatural. now we live in a world in which we don't really believe that strongly in nature or in the idea that there is anything natural about human behavior. So my book asks the question, what is queerness after nature? And to answer that question, we move through many different artists, some of whom are indigenous, many of whom are trans. I look at, along the way in the book, I have a whole chapter just to give you an example of what is queerness after nature. I have a whole chapter on narratives that are being classified as gay, but are not really gay, but have been written by men who have minoritarian desires and express their deep desire for wild birds. Yes, wild birds. So that chapter is called Sex, Death, and Falconry. And it thinks about a very profound desire that some people have projected onto falcons in particular, precisely because predatory birds cannot be tamed. Okay, so this is the idea of a queerness after nature has something, again, to do with the feral and the wild. Fourth, wildness has a very, very clear relationship to Blackness. And I argue here that any investigation into wildness is also a survey of both the outrageously racist claims made within a civilizational discourse, but also at the same time a deep dive into Black art that has produced wild imagery in response to the racist civilizing forms of Euro-American culture. And because I think that there is a very clear political and aesthetic connection between Blackness and wildness, I look throughout the book at art produced by Indigenous and Black artists, and I use a vocabulary drawn from Black studies that includes words like fierceness. And if you're interested in fierceness beyond just, its use in a kind of drag culture, you can look at the work of Madison Moore. The undercommons, which is a term created by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. Waywardness, which is a kind of anarchistic term used by Saidiya Hartman. And these are all Black thinkers who are using wildness to upset the logic of white supremacy as it has been tethered to a kind of eugenic project of civilization. And this piece is by Black artist and MacArthur Fellow Cameron Rowland. Okay, finally then on the topic of wildness, and we'll get to this at the very end of the talk, but this is the end of the first section of the talk. Finally, I think that the force of wildness is not oriented in the same direction that early queer studies was. So early queer studies that was authored by people like Eve Sedgwick, but also Jose Munoz, was deeply interested in the idea of world building. And if you've read any kind of queer studies work from the 2000s, you will have seen that term of world building. And this is a very common way of thinking about utopia. It's making another world in this world. But, and this takes us back to where the wild things are, what if the actual work that we need to do is world unbuilding? And given the shitty state of the world that we inhabit now, I hope that many of you can see that rather than building a new world, we should be unbuilding, taking apart, dismantling, undoing. And I provide here an image that I'll return to later by a Black queer artist, Alvin Baltrop, who took many photographs of men having sex in what were the piers in the 70s and 80s on the western edge of New York City, looking out at the Hudson. And this image captures beautifully the backdrop of men cruising, not against, a neat club in the West Village, but against what Baltrop called a collapsed architecture. So I'm deeply interested in my next book in the idea of collapsed architectures. Okay, moving along. I just want to kind of unfold one of the critical terms that I return to over and over again in this book, and that is bewilderment. And I think in many ways what this book does is explore an aesthetics of bewilderment. And this is just such a great word, bewilderment. And I want to I'm going to explore it in relationship to, and this is what I do in the second chapter of my book, talk about this incredible ballet performance from May 1913, in which Stravinsky's symphony, The Rite of Spring, was choreographed by Nijinsky and turned into a ballet. And it was a ballet that depended heavily upon a fantasy of native peoples, native rhythms, folk peoples, folk dances from early Russia. In the process, what happens is a kind of fantasy of indigeneity gets uploaded into something that becomes central to Western modernism. And what the relationship might be between this folk culture and then the high culture of European modernism is something that has to pass through the territory that I'm calling bewilderment. Okay, so let's think about what bewilderment is. Here's, just so you know, for people who don't know anything about The Rite of Spring, The Rite of Spring was choreographed and set to the music of Stravinsky by Vaslav Nijinsky. The Ballet Russe performance was orchestrated by a Russian, Diaghilev. The ballet was performed once. The choreography has been lost, and the audience for the ballet rioted, is the way that it's described. So it's a very, very interesting event within modernism. It's also an event that I believe produces high degrees of bewilderment. So I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by bewilderment. Now, in terms of the etymology of the word, you can see it, bewilderment. To become wild is literally the meaning of bewilderment. We think about it as like, oh, becoming bewildered, not being sure what's happening. But the actual archaic meaning of bewilderment was to bewilder was to lose someone in a wild place. And you can see why the word's meaning would have changed over the years. We no longer really need that word in that definition because there are very few wild places and we rarely lose ourselves or other people in a world of GPS and maps that come right on your phone and so on. So bewilder has shifted and become a much more abstract term for being confused or confounded. Samuel Johnson in 1709, sometime in the 1700s, described and defined bewilderment as to lose in pathless places, to confound for want of a plain road. So you can see within it is a very clear concept of an anti-civilizational discourse. If many civilizational discourses depended upon this sort of English colonial idea that we are going to wild places and we will bring roads and schools and order to the disorderly jungle places of the world, you can see that that fantasy is embedded in the word bewilder. We're going to use it differently today. We're going to use it to describe a queer indigenous aesthetics that embraces wildness on the one hand, and on the other hand, opposes politically the appropriation of indigenous aesthetics by European modernism. So here are my three takes on bewilderment that I want to offer to you. The first one is that bewilderment now is a kind of fusing of recognition, misrecognition, and disorientation. And that plays out in that Stravinsky-Nijinsky collaboration of The Rite of Spring, in which an audience watching The Rite of Spring is hearing sounds, rhythms from indigenous music and looking at a ballet that actually doesn't use any of the vocabulary from European gestural dance, but in fact is taking a choreography from folk dance. So the audience recognizes that, misrecognizes what it means, is disoriented, and at that point starts to boo the performance. And maybe you can think of performances that have similarly been so different, so shocking in their own moment that audiences have booed off the stage what later became kind of commonplace. So bewilderment is literally the shock of the new that an audience has a very, very difficult time absorbing. Second, bewilderment, and I've done a lot of work on the relationship between low and high cultures, and what I want to say here about bewilderment is that it is a way of infusing high culture with the knowledge of all the things that the high cultural project has appropriated. And through those appropriations, it's not just the absorption of the other, but it's also the becoming wild of high culture, something that writers like Adorno could not acknowledge. So when Adorno was writing about jazz, for example, he just heard noise and he heard a distortion of the proper project of avant-garde music as he understood it to be associated with people like Schopenhauer. So instead, we might think about jazz as literally the becoming wild of high culture. And then finally, a kind of indigenous counter-appropriation. And in relationship to that indigenous counter-appropriation, I'm going to introduce you next to the work then of Kent Monkman. And I hope some of you know Kent Monkman. He's become quite well known in recent years because the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City bought 2 paintings of his, massive paintings that hang in the Great Hall where you go in. One is called The Arrival of the Newcomers, and I can't remember the other one, but they are beautiful paintings representing Native peoples welcoming newcomers to the island. And they stand in stark contrast to the current regime's attitude towards immigration. Kent Monkman is, as I said, a Canadian queer swampy Cree two-spirit artist, and his work literally offers a rejoinder to European high modernism. And just to give you one example, and I don't have the painting here because I couldn't find an image of it. In one painting, he represents a kind of encounter between European artists and native printmakers. And he has an image of Jackson Pollock watching as an indigenous artist splatters dye on a canvas. And Pollock is kind of like, that's interesting, right? And so you get this reminder that many things that appear as new, original, and innovative in movements like abstract expressionism, you can find corollaries to those practices in much earlier work. If indigenous art was ever seen as a kind of origin point for modernism, we would have to recognize and deal with the relationship between these traditional forms, so-called, and these so-called new forms. So let me give you an example, though, of Kent Monkman's strategy of counter-appropriation as it applies to the text that I've already laid out for you, The Rite of Spring. So here's a painting from 1891, and Kent Monkman is a real student of 19th century paintings of the West, often done by white men like George Catlin, who represented native peoples as perverse, as old, as traditional, and as evolving out of existence. And in that way, people like Catlin were very much men of their day, who did not understand themselves as genocidal, agents, but understood that, decided that native cultures were simply evolving out of existence and would fade away as the new world took shape. So this painting by George Catlin was, and it's quite a beautiful painting, but it was made in response to a dance that he saw of a two-spirit person. It was called the Dance to the Burdash. And Catlin described it as one of the most reprehensible and disgusting spectacles he had ever seen. And then he made this painting, and he presumed that whoever saw the painting would agree that this two-spirit trans figure at the center, just to the right of center, was an absolutely perverse and shocking character. Kent Monkman reperformed the Dance of the Burdash. So he studied the painting. He worked with a native choreographer, Michael Grey Eyes, created a dancing that merged traditional powwow with contemporary dance and set the whole performance to a version a piece of music written by Toronto composer Phil Strong that is a free syncopated version of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. So here you can see how a queer native artist looks at literary and choreography from modernism, material taken from European modernism, and reperforms it in order to emphasize the ways in which native artwork lies at the foundation of much of what we understand to be new and original within modernism. Monkman occupies the central role within the Rite of Spring, which is the chosen one. And in Nijinsky's version of the ballet, the chosen one is a young virginal maiden who has to be sacrificed in the Rite of Spring in order to bring fertility to the crops. Instead, Monkman, as a two-spirit person, occupies in this cross-gender way the role of the chosen one, and occupies at the same time the space of the Berdache as captured by George Catlin. Okay, so I just want to give you one last painting by Monkman where you can see more clearly the dynamics of what I'm calling counter-appropriation, because, you know, I don't have any footage of the performance that Monkman gave, so I can't show you that performance in relationship to the Rite of Spring, which that ballet is also completely lost to history. So instead, let's just close this section out, and then I'll do a very short conclusion by looking at a painting from 2014, which is a show that Monkman did to try to completely rewrite the history of Canadian colonialism as it had been told by white colonial authors. In this painting, Seeing Red, he advocates for a way of seeing the world that comes through the eyes of the Indigenous other. And you, as students of art, will see many, many images that have been pulled right out of the history of European art, whether it's, you know, the angel up above, whether it's the Picasso bull kneeling at the feet of the Monkman stand-in, her alter ego she calls Mischief Eagle Testicle, who is the matador. She is holding a Hudson trading blanket, which is modeled upon native designs, but is not native. And then in the background, you actually see actual buffalo. The entire tableau is one that rhymes with what I argued for earlier, an unmaking and unbuilding of the world. It is a kind of riot, but it's a riot that in fact is comfortable with disorder. And there's a whole set of disorderly elements. You have a helicopter, but you also have an angel. So the time periods are clashing. You have on the right, a still from Manet's The Dead Toreador, which was itself a fragment taken from a larger painting. But instead of a dead toreador, you have a toreador who's being tended to by an indigenous healer, right? So this isn't just a kind of bloodbath in which native peoples come violently to claim their land and in the process massacre white people. It's one in which native people come to heal despite the fires burning in the background. There's a sense that there will have to be a reckoning, and that reckoning will be violent in some way, but there's also healing. And all of that plays out on what we can see as a kind of horizontal plane rather than the verticality of a conventional European painting. The other thing is that there are many modes of communication here. There's a totem pole, but also all of the lines crisscrossing the sky that suggest other forms of electricity and communication systems and so on. Okay, and you can, I'm sure, do a lot more with that painting than I can. So all I want to say in conclusion in this section is that Monkman's paintings literally cut up and absorb elements of European painting that already had within them the marks of native aesthetic practice. And it's a kind of taking back, a counter appropriation, a queering of the entire scene of European painting, a clash between classical and indigenous and modernist material. And it showcases in a very queer way relationships between the authentic and the performed. The paintings seek, I would say, and this is my final thing on Bewilderment, they do not seek to classify or to order. They seek to bewilder, confuse, and create a kind of visual plane of chaos. All right. So I want to conclude that, well, one final painting, just so you get the humor of Monkman. This is just a beautifully self-conscious rendering of Monkman's own practice, where there he is drawing, using pictograph forms, an image of a cowboy who's a sort of Saint Sebastian character. And it's a commentary on the power between the artist and the model, and that is the name of the painting. All right, I want to conclude then by, and this moves into the second book that I'm writing on wildness, by arguing almost as a result of thinking through bewilderment, that we move forward arguing for an aesthetics of nothing. Nothing works was Gordon Matta Clark's motto, 1972, when he's somebody who trained in architecture at Cornell and used his architectural training to cut into buildings. He went to the piers where we saw that image from Alvin Baltrop, and cut this beautiful shape into the side of an abandoned pier. And this image is again by Alvin Baltrop. And what he wanted to do was create beauty in the abandoned spaces of the piers, spaces where homeless people lived, drug addicts lived, gay men cruised, all kinds of different, we could say excluded populations lived in the piers. And for Matta Clark, he had a kind of utopian vision in which he wanted to use an architectural methods to create these counterintuitive forms of beauty in abandoned spaces. And that for me connects beautifully to the idea of nothing. And when Matta Clark says nothing works, what he means is, like, the art piece that you're looking at isn't the building. The art piece that he's made is that gap, that dark absence in the side of the building. So it is nothing that is doing the work there. Okay, and that to me is a central principle of an architecture. Okay, I'm not going to dig into too much more about Matta Clark, except to say he did all of these conceptual pieces. This one was one where he basically bought a whole bunch of little tiny micro plots of land in New York City. And this project was called Fake Estates. And it's a kind of riposte to the idea of real estate, reminding us of how speculative real estate is and how the buildings themselves do not hold the value. The value is embedded in market relations. And I just want to give you, this is, you know, another look at what might be at stake in thinking through nothing in relationship to the anarchitectural. This is one of Baltrop's beautiful collapsed architectures. What if we began to unbuild the world in this form? But I want to conclude, I just want to say that another anarchitectural thinker from around the same time is, of course, Audre Lorde, who wrote "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And I think that we have spent too much time thinking about the master's tools and missed the point here. That's political strategy, and the aesthetic strategy is the emphasis is on dismantling the master's house, which is another one of these anarchitectural gestures. Finally, Gordon Matta Clark, you know, plays out the speculative nature of real estate in this beautiful piece he did in 1974, where he literally cuts a house down the middle and then tilts it back on its foundation in order to, you know, make another statement about fake estates versus real estate. Okay, we can talk more about that later. I want to conclude though with a quote from Ursula Le Guin that relates exactly to that Gordon Matta Clark / Alvin Baltrop project of collapsed architecture. So on behalf of this aesthetics of nothing, which will make up a large part of my second book on wildness, I'm going to have a long chapter on Ursula Le Guin's sort of utopian, sort of dystopian works from 1969 to 1974. So they include The Left Hand of Darkness, and then this book, The Dispossessed. The Dispossessed is, and I just tell you a little bit about the story, and then I'll tell you about the character who says this, gives us this anarchitectural statement. Those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to, and think about Trump there building a wall to keep out immigrants and refugees. Our character in The Dispossessed, Shevik, says, I'm going to fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to unbuild walls. Shevik in The Dispossessed is a physicist living on an anarchist planet that a group of dissenters went to because they were completely dissatisfied with the capitalist planet that they lived on, which was called Eurus. And they make a new world on a neighboring planet called Anuris. They are guided by the anarchist principles of a beloved philosopher called Odo, and they seek to live in a world that is cooperative, fueled by mutual aid, lacking hierarchies, and guided by principles of sharing rather than competition. However, Shevik is a physicist, and he's made a discovery about time and simultaneity. And so the capitalist planet flies him over to share his work with their scientists. When he gets to the capitalist planet, he's very taken with his freedom, his new freedom, the possibility of drinking and going out and eating rich food and so on. He's completely seduced. And then quickly the seduction wanes and he becomes deeply sad, depressed, and dissatisfied. And at that moment, a resistance group gets in touch with him. And I just want to give you the cover of the original Dispossessed, and his Shevik looking back at his own planet from the capitalist world. So the resistant underground get in touch with him. And in the final pages of the book, he meets up with the underground group and he gives a speech. And in this speech, he says, we know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and that the hand you reach out is as empty as mine is. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give. So I want to end with this idea that this is what is behind my emphasis on bewilderment, wildness, unbuilding, unmaking, collapsed architecture, is on behalf of a freedom rooted in nothing. And this actually, I think, is very much in tune with some of the Afro-pessimist work by Calvin Warren and others who argue that blackness represents nothing in a kind of Heideggerian system of being and nothingness, but that nothing has its own potential. And its potential is to oppose the possessive investment made by capitalism in things, commodities, accumulation, and profit. So what if the route to freedom is to possess nothing, to have nothing, to own nothing? And I end then with this beautiful image of a collaborator of mine, boy child, Tosh Bascaro, who performs this beautiful, what they call a hand dance. And I think it's a dance that it's beautifully rhyming with the rite of spring, but is also demonstrating a kind of empty-handedness, that it must accompany, I will propose, all movements that we might make towards unbuilding the future. And I'll stop there and hope that we have time for some questions. Let me stop sharing. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack, so much for a very stimulating and also entertaining talk. And I know it's given us all a lot to think about. So I can throw in some questions that we have from students, and Aspen can field some from the Q&A here too. So everyone, please enter your questions into the Q&A. We'll try to mix in some questions from each of our classes for Jack. So I'll perhaps start us off with a question for you, Jack. I'm thinking about the different elements of your talk. you know, where you're taking us on this ride through where the wild things are. You talked about Monkman, you talked about Le Guin, and I guess this has to do with your idea of low theory, really. You're the scholar who introduced me to the idea of low theory and how it kind of carries with it this potential to analyze big systems and big institutions and big powers. But you're using these kinds of pop culture references, and not only that, but like a stratification of different types of references that we don't ordinarily see, you know, in like European culture, for instance. So can you talk a little bit about your concept of low theory and why you always return to it in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, you know, the way I'm sort of building on that earlier idea of low theory, and low theory was just to say if there is such a thing as high theory, which we often associate with the Frankfurt School and with Western philosophy, at a moment when we're trying to pull apart some of the ideologies and some of the philosophical systems that fuel our current crisis, shouldn't we turn to the material that has been suppressed by that high theory? Shouldn't we be less interested, you know, in the kind of lineage of Hegel, Heidegger, Kant, and so on, and more interested in the suppressed and subaltern thinkers who were consistently and constantly offering opposition to the logic of the Enlightenment? So that would be one strand of low theory. And then the other is, of course, the mass cultural material, which just because it appears within pop culture or mass culture does not necessarily disqualify it from the role of offering a kind of resistant frame. The idea that, you know, that kind of Frankfurt School idea that the difficult text is the only one that is capable of jamming the culture industry is just simply not true. And so I think there are so many artists, young artists nowadays who are able to almost effortlessly pull high and low cultural references into communication with each other. And that's part of, you know, what I'm interested in now. And Monkman is one of those people. He's both giving you sometimes very caricatured, almost cartoonish imagery, but on the other hand, all of it is in opposition to a very deeply studied and learned relationship to art history.
Excellent, thank you. Aspen, do you want to throw in some questions from the Q&A chat there?
Sure, we don't have a ton of questions, but here's a really good one from Dr. Jim Frakes. He's an art historian here at our school. It's a longer question, but in 2018, the Charlotte Symphony staged a ballet of Rite of Spring, which was danced in large part by local children, most of whom were not white and all of whom were from underserved school districts with no arts program necessarily. The choreography was based on children's habits of movement and play. It was presented with great fanfare as reaching out to the population that is not fully integrated into kind of the cultural scene. It was a lovely performance, he says, and I wonder today, as I listened to you, what you'd say about it. Was it an introduction of wildness? Those children were a bit like Max in Where the Wild Things Are, or was it an attempt to codify wildness into a civilized order? Did it build a world or work to unbuild one? Could it have been both?
Wow, that's just fantastic. Thank you so much for letting me know about this event. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you know, the Rite of Spring is now it's such a canonical text. And of course, it recently, we celebrated its centenary. And so every city's symphony had staged a version of Rite of Spring. And yet, as I say in the introduction to my book, it's also formed the inspiration for many, many different jazz pieces by Ornette Coleman, Alice Coltrane, and others. It's clearly a piece that is both influenced by jazz as well as responding to jazz movements of that moment. But I think it's one of these texts, you just can't get around it. And so I think this is a beautiful illustration of the ubiquity of that, something about that music, the way in which it could be rendered, yes, by potentially untrained dancers, child dancers, who the free movements of play are given, you know, there's room for that in relationship to the orchestral maneuvers in Rite of Spring. I think that's a fantastic example. Are they a bit like Max? A little bit, but in my intro, I'm a bit agnostic about Max. Is Max a colonial wanderer who is like, forget about the family home, I'm striking out on my own, and then ends up somewhere where he's like, now I'm king of the universe, you know? Is that what we want? Or do we want to resist the idea that we'll leave the family home where we are ruled and go somewhere else where we may rule? I'm arguing for an anti-colonial relationship to both wild things and where the wild things are. And I think that requires us to do quite a bit of unbuilding. And we will not be led by Max, you know, in the end, we will be led by, we will have to recognize the wild thing that we may be, rather than looking for wildness always elsewhere.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We have another question about space and the kind of abandoned spaces that you talked about in relation to Alan Baltrop and Gordon Matta Clark,
Right.
and Chelsea Piers. So the question has to do with in New York City at the moment, is there a kind of a culture of these spaces shrinking? Like, do these spaces still exist, like the Chelsea Piers? Since the city's been dominated by real estate that seems to eliminate these wild spaces, are they, at least for the time being, kind of unavailable in New York?
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen post-COVID whether there will again be white flight from the city. I mean, we definitely, you know, if you follow the various articles on people fleeing to the suburbs in the New York Times over the past 6 months, you'll see that once again, in moment of crisis, white flight characterized a kind of a massive exodus from the city by white middle-class people. And there is a question as to whether those people will come back. Of course, the city hopes they do because they need the tax revenue, but many people hope in a way that New York City will experience a kind of collapse, the same kind of collapse it experienced in the 1970s that created the piers in the first place. The piers became abandoned space that gay men, homeless people, drug users, and others use, precisely because the West Side Highway collapsed, left that space inaccessible to traffic, and most importantly, to the police. And that then created a kind of lawless space that could be repopulated. And yes, it was dangerous. I mean, one shouldn't, you know, kind of just completely romanticize such a space, but the danger was, it's no more dangerous than, you know, Fifth Avenue might be for a person of color in the middle of a crowded workday. So I think that New York City in boom times cannot be that kind of space. But the question is open as to whether New York's going to fall, and that fall could be part of the remaking of this earlier project of collapsed architectures. Mm-hmm. And you know, in a moment, you know, at a moment where we all recognize how rapacious real estate actually is, and when people are being turned out of their homes and so on, we should hope that luxury real estate falls and collapses. We should all hope that, because it is really the only way that some kind of economic redistribution can occur.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we have another question about audience and low and high art forms as well. Could you talk a little bit about the centrality of, or attempts to decentralize, audience in this sort of artificial split between high and low art forms?
Well, audience is tricky, isn't it? I mean, Monkman has recently, you know, found this massive audience, but even 3 years ago when I was giving a talk in Toronto, Monkman, who was very well known already in Canada and in Toronto, was enough of a kind of everyday integrated cultural worker, let's say, that he had an open studio while I was in Toronto, and I went to it, and you could just like wander around his massive studio space that was in a kind of divey warehouse district in Toronto, And you could be right that close to these massive canvases. There was nothing precious about it, like don't get near the painting with red wine, or, you know, it was completely like, there was a kind of, I don't know, I don't really want to use the word humility, but unpretentiousness about Monkman's relationship to audience that was stunning to me, like just stunning, you know, really, really was. So audiences are unpredictable when you do merge high and low. And it's what brings, you know, it's why museums can sometimes have massive shows that, you know, Matisse suddenly becomes the object of like mass attention, when in fact he's been claimed for a kind of high modernist context. So audience is very unpredictable, but increasingly I think we're living in an era where we want to figure out audiences that are not simply being curated by social media. You know, like something that goes viral that's not random, it's being set up to go viral. So I think we all actually have to think very differently about audiences now in an era when on Twitter, you know, idiotic influencers rule everything. We should not be looking for massive audiences. I think we should be thinking in more careful ways about audience.
I have a question regarding places that you found subversive messages. So what for you has been the most surprising place that you've found subversive messages? Which particular children's film in general? Sounds like there's a particular interest in children's film there.
Oh my gosh, I mean, I find subversive messages in most children's culture, precisely because children are not seen to have any kind of ideological orientation. And so lots of material that you wouldn't find in, you know, visual culture directed at adults finds its way into children's culture. And, you know, I have a whole chapter on that in The Queer Art of Failure. My top texts are like Chicken Run, which is really about a feminist revolution, Finding Nemo, which is about mass kind of communist cooperation in an underworld that is underwater. And then in the book, it's The Secret Life of Pets, which is in which I indulge the fantasy that your household pet is just waiting for the opportunity to savage you in your sleep to further the aims of an animal revolution against human domination. That's unfortunately not the plot of The Secret Life of Pets, but it's how I play it out if it were a risk-taking text. So the Lego Movie is a fantastic text that I use at the end of Transasterix to explain how Lego gives us a beautiful metaphor for how we might want to build and unbuild ourselves continuously, rather than just transitioning from one legible gendered position to another. So I find constant inspiration in children's films, which of course was why I decided to write about what I called low culture. Children's culture is almost always classified as low, but you know, as far as I'm concerned, inspiration is, you know, wherever you find it, and there's plenty there.
Great. Well, we're already over time. So do we
Okay.
have time for maybe one more question?
Sure.
Okay. A student had a question about Gaga feminism. Can you just talk about Gaga feminism, what your concept is of that briefly?
Yeah, and you know, it was seen as having to do with Lady Gaga, but it's really to do with this going Gaga, this idea that we need a feminism that is less orderly. I mean, you can hear this theme throughout what I've presented, that it's about not being quite so organized and not being quite so clear and legible and recognizable. But I was simply calling in Gaga feminism for an updated, new, innovative version of feminism that recognized that we are not just men and women trying to figure out equality, but in fact there are multiple genders, and therefore we need new narratives and new scripts for this moment in which many young people define themselves as non-binary, and the politics of gender and sexuality is a really complex and changing field. So Gaga feminism is that kind of feminism.
Excellent. Okay. Well, amazing. Thank you, Jack, again, for a mind-blowing experience as usual. It's great to see you and that you're doing well. And we'll say goodbye. And I hope everybody has a great day and everyone stays safe. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, hope to
Thank
see
you.
you in North Carolina sometime. Thank you.